In the fading light of a dying empire, the once mighty eternal city stood silent under a blood-red sky, its marble columns cracked, and its forums empty, where the echoes of marching legions had long since faded into whispers of forgotten glory. The year was 476 AD, and a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer had just deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, as if returning a relic to a distant shrine. But this was no sudden thunderclap of history. It was the final, inevitable sigh of a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not merely the end of an era. It was a profound historical turning point that reshaped the destiny of Europe, fractured the unity of the Mediterranean world, and ushered in the long shadows of the Middle Ages. As the sun set on Rome's western domains, the world held its breath, unaware that the collapse unfolding in the heart of Italy would echo through millennia, influencing laws, languages, and the very foundations of modern society. The grandeur that was Rome, built on conquest, engineering marvels, and unyielding ambition, was crumbling from within, its vast territories splintering like ancient pottery under the weight of invisible forces. Yet to understand this rupture, one must journey back to the height of its power, where the air hummed with the promise of eternity. The Roman Empire at its zenith stretched from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of North Africa, encompassing a tapestry of cultures bound by Roman roads that sliced through forests and mountains like veins of civilization. In the bustling streets of Rome, the heartbeat of the empire pulsed with the clamor of merchants, haggling over spices from the east, gladiators training in the shadow, and senators debating in the curia amid the scent of incense and olive oil. Daily life for the average citizen blended routine with spectacle. Farmers tended terraced vineyards under the watchful gaze of aqueducts that carried fresh water for miles. Slaves toiled in grand villas adorned with intricate mosaics depicting gods and heroes, and legions patrolled the frontiers, their iron discipline maintaining order across provinces where Latin became the lingua franca of trade and governance. Families gathered for meals of bread, wine, and garum, while public baths echoed with laughter and political gossip. The empire's infrastructure, bridges, forums, and amphitheaters, stood as testaments to human ingenuity, fostering a sense of permanence that few dared question. This was an age of relative stability under the Pax Romana, where the Mediterranean was a Roman lake, safe for galleys laden with grain from Egypt and silk from distant China. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, subtle fractures were forming, invisible at first, but gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, hinting that even the mightiest oak could rot from its core. Before the collapse accelerated, life in the provinces flowed with a deceptive rhythm of continuity. In Gaul, local elites adopted Roman customs, building bathhouses and villas while speaking Latin, and worshipping at temples dedicated to Jupiter alongside local deities. In Hispania, olive groves and mines supplied the empire's insatiable appetite for resources, with slaves and freemen working side by side under the shadow of imperial edicts. The army, once the backbone of expansion, now recruited heavily from barbarian auxiliaries, their loyalty bought with land and gold, blending cultures in the ranks. Women managed households, raised children in the shadow of ancestral lares, and participated in religious festivals that blended pagan rites with emerging Christian influences. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world, and the imperial postal system connected distant governors to the emperor in swift relays. This interconnected web created an illusion of invincibility, where citizens believed Rome's destiny was eternal, ordained by the gods or divine providence. But the daily grind masked deeper vulnerabilities. Inflation gnawed at the currency, as emperors debased coins to fund endless campaigns, and taxes burdened the peasantry, driving many into the arms of wealthy landowners for protection. The empire's vastness, once its strength, was becoming a liability, straining supply lines and administrative cohesion, as borders grew harder to defend against restless tribes pressing from the north and east. Early warning signs emerged quietly, like cracks in a grand edifice, unnoticed until the structure groaned. In the 3rd century, a period of crisis known as the Year of the Five Emperors gave way to military anarchy, with short-lived rulers assassinated in rapid succession amid civil wars that drained the treasury and weakened frontier defenses. Economic stagnation set in as reliance on slave labor stifled innovation, while plagues, such as the Antonine Plague, swept through the population, killing millions and leaving fields untilled and legions under strength. Climatic shifts brought droughts and cooler temperatures that disrupted agriculture in key provinces, leading to food shortages that fueled unrest. Barbarian migrations intensified, not as mere raids but as desperate movements of entire peoples fleeing the Huns, a ferocious nomadic force from the steppes whose arrival sent shockwaves through the Germanic tribes. Emperors like Diocletian attempted reforms, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves for better governance, but these measures only highlighted the fractures. Corruption festered in the bureaucracy, with officials enriching themselves at the expense of public works, and the once proud legions became fragmented, their loyalty shifting from Rome to local commanders. Yet the Roman elite, ensconced in their villas, dismissed these tremors as temporary setbacks, convinced that the eternal city would endure as it always had. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly in the overlooked margins of empire. As the 4th century unfolded, rising tension gripped the Western Empire like a tightening noose. The division into East and West, intended to stabilize rule, instead created rival centers of power, with Constantinople thriving, while Rome's western domains struggled under the burden of defending vast borders with dwindling resources. Barbarian groups, including the Visigoths, crossed the Danube in increasing numbers, seeking refuge in farmland after being displaced by the Huns. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD became a catastrophic turning point, where Roman forces suffered a devastating defeat, losing an emperor and much of the Eastern Field Army, exposing the military's vulnerabilities. Economic pressures mounted as hyperinflation eroded trust in currency, forcing reliance on barter and local strongmen. Christianity's rise, formalized under Constantine, shifted spiritual and cultural loyalties, sometimes dividing elites and draining resources into church building rather than fortifications. Internal power struggles among generals and usurpers further eroded central authority, turning the empire into a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions. The air in Rome grew thick with uncertainty. Whispers of omens and prophecies circulated in forums, while along the frontiers, watchtowers stood vigilant against shadows moving through the forests. The system, once a marvel of organization, was buckling under the weight of its own complexity and external pressures, yet decisions made in distant palaces often ignored the growing instability on the ground. Key decisions and mistakes accelerated the descent into failure. Emperors like Honorius, isolated in Ravenna, prioritized court intrigues over frontier defense, while generals such as Stilicho balanced alliances with barbarian foederati against traditional Roman pride. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 AD shattered the psychological invincibility of the Eternal City, sending ripples of shock across the empire, even though the physical damage was limited. Policies of accommodation, settling barbarian tribes within Roman territories in exchange for military service, provided short-term relief, but sowed seeds of fragmentation, as these groups retained their own leaders and customs. Heavy taxation to fund armies led to depopulation in rural areas, with peasants fleeing to cities or banditry. The failure to integrate or decisively defeat incoming waves of invaders, compounded by civil wars that pitted Roman against Roman, drained the lifeblood of the state. Environmental strains, including soil exhaustion and pandemics, reduced agricultural output, making it impossible to sustain large urban populations or standing armies. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire had become a hollow shell, its provinces slipping away one by one as local rulers asserted independence. The pressures were relentless, a confluence of human error, natural calamity, and inexorable historical forces that no single leader could reverse. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single cataclysm, but through cascading breakdowns that rendered central authority illusory. In the provinces, Roman governors lost control as barbarian kings carved out kingdoms within imperial borders, collecting taxes and administering justice in their own names. Rome itself, stripped of its defensive legions, became vulnerable to repeated sieges and sacks, its population dwindling amid famine and disease. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 by Odoacer marked the symbolic end, yet for many, daily existence continued under new masters who adopted Roman titles and laws to legitimize their rule. Trade networks collapsed as roads fell into disrepair and piracy returned to the seas. Great public works crumbled without maintenance, and literacy declined outside monastic enclaves. The once unified legal and administrative framework fragmented, replaced by a mosaic of Germanic kingdoms overlaid on Roman remnants. Fear spread through villages as stories of raids circulated, and the silence of abandoned forums spoke volumes of a world unraveling. The collapse was a process of slow dissolution, where the institutions that had defined Roman identity eroded until they could no longer hold the empire together. By the time the signs became unmistakable, the old order had already slipped away into legend. Human consequences of the rupture were profound and harrowing, reshaping societies in ways both tragic and transformative. Millions faced displacement, famine, and violence as supply chains broke and urban centers depopulated. Once thriving cities like those in Gaul and Italy saw their populations shrink dramatically, with survivors retreating to fortified hilltops or seeking patronage from local warlords. Social breakdown manifested in the erosion of class structures, as slaves gained freedoms in the chaos, and Roman aristocrats intermarried with barbarian elites, creating hybrid identities. Cultural losses were immense. Libraries burned or neglected, engineering knowledge faded, and artistic traditions simplified into cruder forms. Yet amid the suffering, seeds of renewal took root. Christianity provided a unifying spiritual framework, preserving Latin learning in monasteries that would later fuel the Renaissance. Families huddled in fear during nights punctuated by distant howls of wolves and war bands, while survivors adapted by blending Roman law with Germanic customs, laying groundwork for medieval Europe. The psychological toll was incalculable. A people who had seen themselves as masters of the world now navigated a landscape of uncertainty, where the future belonged to those strong enough to forge new paths from the ruins. The human cost underscored the fragility of even the greatest civilizations when internal decay met external shocks. The long-term historical impact of Rome's fall reverberated far beyond the 5th century, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Western civilization. The vacuum left in the West allowed for the emergence of successor states that evolved into the kingdoms of France, Spain, and Italy, blending Roman administrative legacies with Germanic warrior traditions. Latin fragmented into the Romance languages, while Roman law influenced legal systems across Europe for centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, endured for another millennium, preserving classical knowledge and acting as a bulwark against further invasions, eventually transmitting Greek and Roman heritage back to the West via scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest. Trade routes shifted, contributing to the rise of new powers and the eventual age of exploration. Feudalism arose from the need for local protection in the absence of central authority, shaping medieval society for hundreds of years. Intellectually, the period known as the Dark Ages saw a decline in urban life and literacy, yet it also fostered innovation in agriculture and monastic scholarship that prepared the ground for the Carolingian Renaissance and beyond. Rome's collapse served as a cautionary archetype, reminding later empires of the perils of overextension, economic fragility, and unchecked migration pressures. Its legacy endures in architecture, governance, and the very concept of Western identity. In the end, the fall of the Western Roman Empire stands as one of history's most haunting turning points, a testament to the impermanence of human achievement and the complex interplay of forces that can unravel even the most formidable powers. As ruins of aqueducts and amphitheaters still dot the European landscape, they whisper of a time when Rome seemed eternal, only to yield to transformation through collapse. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but the prelude to new beginnings, where medieval Europe would rise from the fragments, carrying forward echoes of imperial glory in cathedrals and charters. Today, as we witness our own eras of uncertainty, the story of Rome invites reflection on the delicate balance that sustains civilizations, the warnings too often ignored, the decisions that tip the scales, and the resilience of humanity amid rupture. The empire did not vanish overnight. It faded into myth and memory, its influence shaping the modern world in ways both visible and unseen. In that quiet dissolution lies a profound truth. No society is immune to the tides of history, and every golden age carries within it the seeds of its own evolution or end. The collapse reshaped everything, leaving us to ponder what endures when empires fall.